I'm so excited to be sitting down with Joe Dickson. Joe has been at the forefront of food safety and standards for decades. He served as the global director of quality standards at Whole Foods and sits on the boards of major organizations such as the Non-GMO Project and the USDA National Organic Standards Board. And we are so proud to call him an advisor to Little Spoon. Joe has really set the bar in food and agricultural standards, and he's here to dive into some big questions today with us. So, Joe, I'm so excited to jump into this. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Angela. I'm so excited to be here and so excited to be working with you and your team on Little Spoon's innovation in food safety for babies.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so you've been in the industry for over 25 years. How have things changed when it comes to food safety, especially for babies and kids? And are we in a better place now, or do you think there's still a long way to go?
Yes, and yes. Over the last 25 years, we've seen so many advances in pathogen control, understanding microbiology, testing technology that allows us to test at lower and lower levels of detection for contaminants like pesticides and heavy metals. But there's so far to go. Companies like Little Spoon are bearing the weight of integrity in a lot of these categories where good companies out there are testing and going the extra mile to make food safe. But on the regulatory side, especially in the US, I think the Food and Drug Administration has very far to go in terms of making sure that safe food using the technology that's now available is available for everyone. And that is the default condition for all families. So I think, and we can get into some details, but I think, in terms of regulating pesticide residues, assessing the safety of pesticides, having reasonable approaches to heavy metals, our government certainly has the ways to go.
Yep. So let's talk about government and let's talk about regulations for a minute. So there's a ton of debate about what's safe enough. How do the current baby and kid food regulations stack up? And what's your take on where the industry or industries in general need to push further?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of different dimensions of the regulations around baby food, from acceptable levels of heavy metals, contaminants, to just basic food ingredients. Here in I compare us a lot to the EU, and other countries where the approach is really precautionary. In the EU, government tends to take an approach of erring on the side of caution and really proving something safe before it's allowed. In the US, we tend to take a different approach where, you kind of have to prove that something's bad to have it removed from the market rather than take a more precautionary approach. And so with food ingredients, we see that where, artificial colors, which have been associated with hyperactivity and other issues with children, they're warning labels in the EU, and they're widely used in kid products here in the US. When we look at heavy metals, which is something, we'll talk about a lot today, just the acceptable levels in the EU versus the US. The FDA has the Closer to Zero initiative where they've set interim action levels for lead and arsenic in baby food. And the level in the US is twice the level in the EU. So our regulation, but the Closer to Zero initiative is a new initiative in the last few years. And prior to that, the FDA really wasn't saying much about this area of risk. So it's progress. But compared to other nations and compared to what is possible, we have a ways to go.
And would you say that we should be demanding similar standards here in the US as they have in the EU? We've been getting a lot of questions from our customers ever since we announced our baby food standards. So, about versus US. So curious to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, I think, more importantly than adopting similar standards is adopting a similar approach. Erring on the side of precaution, especially when it comes to babies and kids who are our most vulnerable developing humans. The argument for being as cautious as possible is extremely strong. And that's the approach the EU has taken. I think your customers and your team are right in the assertion that, the EU's approach is a better for our kids.
And so talk to us about some of the proposals that are out in the US over these past few years. We see different proposals from different government bodies and politicians bubble up. How are scientific bodies reacting to those? Where do we stand today on regulation for baby and kids food in the US?
Yeah, well, again, I mentioned the Closer to Zero initiative. which aims to set action levels for heavy metals in kid foods. Even with that, they've set levels for lead and arsenic. They have yet to address the other substances of concern, although that is in motion. There's a proposed piece of legislation called the Baby Food Safety Act of 2024, which would enact some pretty strict standards around baby and toddler food, again, focusing on heavy metals. And it's in, the bowels of Congress, and, I don't know that it'll see the light of day this year or anytime too soon. And I think, in general, depending on the scientific bodies, and there's a wide range of perspective there from, academic scientific bodies to, some of the chemical industry and sort of big baby food companies, there's a lot of perspective there. But in general, I think, people have reacted positively, but there's a perception that we're not going far enough or fast enough.
Yeah.
We have lead in our applesauce. That happened this year. And, the fact that there isn't a regulatory framework that could have prevented that is an area of deep concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's pretty shocking. And I mean, that's, of course, the impetus behind our whole transparency campaign and setting our own standards, because, we couldn't wait for the government to impose those standards. And it was really something that we found our customers were demanding.
Exactly. In the absence of the regulation that we need, the onus lies on companies to set standards. And, the way that you've done it by being so transparent about what those standards are, I think in the few weeks since it's been announced, I think it's clear that approach really builds trust.
Absolutely. Okay, so a lot of parents hear the word organic, but we often hear from our community that there's still confusion about what that means exactly. Has the definition evolved over the years, and what should parents know about organic?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and it's a really confusing term, an area of regulation that I've been working on for 25 years. The definition has evolved a bit over the years, but the foundation of what organic means has not changed since the National Organic Standards went into effect back in 2002. So a little bit about what parents should know about what organic means when you see the word organic or the USDA seal on any food made in the U.S. By law, that has to be certified to the USDA National Organic Standards. And those require, first and foremost, that plants or anything is grown without the use of toxic or persistent agricultural chemicals. So that's pesticides like organophosphates and neonicotinoids. That's herbicides like glyphosate, also known as Roundup. All of those substances are not allowed in organic production. GMOs are completely banned in organic. If you see organic on a label, it is non-GMO automatically. Organic also bans the use of irradiation and sewage sludge. Biosolids, human waste, are often used as fertilizers in agriculture. And going back to our earlier conversations, those can often be a source of heavy metals and other contaminants introduced into the agricultural supply chain, and that's banned in organic. When it comes to animal products that are organic, they're always raised without antibiotics, always without synthetic growth hormones, always fed organic food, and given access to the outdoors and clean water. And in 2025, a new set of standards, the Organic Livestock and Poultry Standard, will evolve those animal welfare requirements and make them much stricter. Organic, unlike, agriculture in general in the U.S., there is a USDA accredited certifier inspecting every step of the supply chain from the farm to the factory until it goes jar that goes into the stores. And so that level of visibility is another huge differentiator for organic. And so it means so many different things. And, when I go into a grocery store, I see that seal and it's short for antibiotics and GMOs and Roundup and so many things you want to avoid as a parent or just a consumer of food. It's, in my opinion, the most powerful certification seal you see in the grocery store. And, one thing I want to add too, I ramble about organic. It's an area I get very excited about. The National Organic Standards came to be back in 1990 through the Organic Foods Production Act, largely to protect families and children in particular. In 1989, there was what we call the Alar scare. We learned that Alar, a substance applied to apples pretty close to harvest, was associated with cancer in laboratory animals. And there was a huge panic. There was a 60 Minutes episode about, are we poisoning our children with apples? There was a Newsweek cover story about this where the tagline was, "Don't panic if it's organic." But prior to 1990, there was no legal definition. And so we immediately saw rampant fraud in the organic sector. Bad actors just relabeling conventionally grown stuff as organic to take advantage of the good intentions of parents and families who are seeking out organic food for the first time. And so we created a federal standard to protect the good actors and the farmers that were truly farming organically and the parents and families who are seeking truly safer products. And that's what led the government to create that standard.
Wow, that's so interesting. I had no idea. What would you say to parents who obviously want to feed their kids all organic, but maybe can't afford to buy all of their produce organic? Are there certain items that you would prioritize purchasing organic over others?
Yeah, absolutely. Fresh produce in general, but I highly recommend the environmental working group's Dirty Dozen. They, on an annual basis, look at pesticide residue data for all of the major produce crops. And they list out the most important ones to buy organic if you're able, where there's more of a risk of the presence of conventional pesticides and chemicals in the products.
Then I want to talk a little bit about GMOs. So a lot of people choose to avoid GMOs, but many aren't really sure why. Can you share about what GMOs actually are and why there is concern around them?
Yeah, absolutely. So GMOs are agricultural crops that have been genetically engineered through biotechnology, typically introducing DNA that isn't naturally part of the plant's DNA to change the way that it grows, behaves, exists as a plant. And so, the possibilities are endless. It's an amazing technology that can do a lot of different things. But in U.S. agriculture, what biotechnology has been used to do in our crops is make it either produce its own pesticides or be herbicide tolerant. So that means I have a field of corn that is Roundup resistant. I spray that whole field with Roundup and all the weeds die, but the corn doesn't. If we would look at corn, soy, canola, cotton, sugar beets, alfalfa, the major GMO crops grown in the US, they're largely herbicide tolerant. And so my biggest concern is that allows for an unprecedented amount of agricultural chemicals and herbicides to be sprayed on crops. And that exposes consumers and farm workers and the environment to levels of herbicides that are beyond anything that we've experienced prior to these technologies. And so it's herbicide intensive. It's bad for the environment. We know that Roundup is a likely carcinogen. There's so many reasons to not want that kind of corn on our tables. It's not just the sweet corn we're eating. It's the industrial corn that goes into corn syrup and maltodextrin and, hundreds and hundreds of food ingredients. So that's, one of the main objections. I think farm worker health is another big one. We're seeing a lot of data now on the cancer risk to farmers who have been working with glyphosate and 2,4-D and other chemicals like that over the last several decades. And then another area that a lot of people, myself included, object to is just the sort of food sovereignty angle where, when I grow a GMO crop, the seed company owns that intellectual property. They don't allow me to save my seeds. They don't allow me to breed. I get sued if I save my seeds. There's this issue of, very large multinational seed companies controlling the system and selling you both the seeds and the herbicides you need to successfully grow those seeds. So I think in the organic and sustainable agriculture community, we see a lot of concern about that consolidation of the seeds themselves and the intellectual property.
Wow, that's so interesting. I had no idea. So, we're talking about organic, we're talking about GMOs. I mean, there's been a lot of news about contaminants in baby food, and this is an issue that's important to us at Little Spoon. So can you help us break down how these contaminants get into food? Is this something that's an issue with produce in general, and how can we fix it?
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue with produce in general. It's more of an issue with certain types of produce, like, root vegetables tend to take up a lot more heavy metals from the soil. But how does this stuff get there? There are several ways, for example, lead and arsenic might end up in the soil. Some of it can be naturally occurring in some geographies, but most of it that is affecting agriculture is either coming from the historic use of agricultural chemicals. Like we see a lot of arsenic in rice because it historically was used as a chemical input in cotton production, which happened to take place in some of the same areas where rice is now grown. And so the arsenic has a very long life in the soil and stays there for a really long time. We also see heavy metals getting into soil from industrial uses, wastewater from factories, smelters, and steel producing regions. There's a lot of industrial ways that either airborne or waterborne contaminants and heavy metals get into agricultural land. And then, as I mentioned, some crops take it up more than others. We know, sweet potatoes and carrots and a lot of root vegetables, because they grow in the soil with all that soil contact, take it up a little more. Fortunately, we are now, we have an unprecedented ability to test soil and water and crops for contaminants, for heavy metals, and, can more intelligently choose crops for a given site, avoid certain land altogether. And really intelligently hone in on sources of contamination to make safer products. And then with pesticides, that's a little more straightforward. All of them are in the environment largely from agriculture. Some are persistent in the soil and have survived from, earlier uses of conventional chemicals. Sometimes it's drift. If I have a crop dusting plane spraying my cornfield, a lot of that's going to get on my neighbor's field unless we take measures to protect his field. Fortunately, that is one area where organic offers a lot of benefits. To make an organic claim on a crop, I have to manage the land organically for 3 entire years before I can put the word organic on it. And while that doesn't always solve the problem, in most cases, it does a really good job of ensuring that pesticide residues have worked their way out of the system.
And so there's always a debate for parents between making food at home versus buying it. What would you say parents should keep in mind when deciding between homemade and store-bought food for their kids, and should they feel the pressure to do it themselves?
That's a tough one because, of course, the ultimate way to control the ingredients is to formulate the product yourself and, boil vegetables and puree them in your own home. Food safety is also really hard, and our kids are really vulnerable. There are measures that can be taken in a commercial facility that you don't always hit perfectly in a home kitchen. Handling products, storage temperatures, ensuring that microbes from the outside of a fruit don't get inside, all of that. If you're really doing your research and you know how to process and store your food safely, it can be a great option, but it can be really risky, especially because at home, when I go to the grocery store and buy berries or winter squash, I don't have the ability to talk to that producer or test it for heavy metals or understand that entire supply chain. I would rather work with a company that has those supplier relationships, has that testing throughout the supply chain, and takes all of those steps that I can't take at home as a parent. So I think, it's certainly okay to make your own food, but I think you gain a lot when you work with a trusted brand that can see into the entire supply chain and make sure it's safe.
Yep, absolutely. And at Little Spoon, we are working very closely with all of our suppliers and making sure that everything we're sourcing is hitting our own, public facing rigorous limits.
Yeah, and that's great. Very few home cooks can do that and go all the way back to the farm. So that's a huge advantage of working with a brand like Little Spoon.
Yeah. So the average adult makes something like 35,000 decisions a day, and about 200 of those are on food alone. Parents are tired and stressed. We know this. They have a lot on their plates. So how can brands like Little Spoon help take some of that pressure off by making the right choices easy?
I'm overwhelmed just hearing that question. I'm not a parent, and I go into the grocery store and get overwhelmed by the choices and how to prioritize money and safety and integrity. I think it can be really reassuring when you go into a store or go online and there are brands that you trust, that I as a consumer just know that you have my best interests in mind. But it's hard, as you know, for a brand to build that trust. It comes down to having rigorous standards, having testing and contaminant limits. I think transparency is really important. Sharing your standards as a brand, telling consumers, why should you trust me? So that the next time you come into the store, you just grab my product and don't have to think about whether it's good or not. And, one of the things I have always looked for as a retailer and a consultant and advisor to brands that I think is so important is the brand having a clear mission and a clear why and a clear impact they want to have in the world. That combined with transparency is, I think, how brands can have the best impact for parents who are staring down a baby food aisle of hundreds and hundreds of products, or a yogurt aisle. Every aisle of the store has thousands of products in it, and you don't know where to look. And you take out your phone and you start to Google, like, is this a bad ingredient? I don't even remember. It is so overwhelming. And I think one of the most important tools or life hacks for a consumer in that moment is to have brands that they have a trusting relationship with. That helps you focus in and ignore the other 199 brands and just focus on one you know that you can buy with confidence.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole goal of our transparency campaign and this new effort that we're rolling out. So any customers or prospective customers can go to our website. They could see our no list. They could see our farms where we're sourcing our produce. They could see our standards for heavy metals, pesticides, glyphosate, plasticizers. So I think that's really great advice. So as someone who's been deep in the world of food safety, what do you see as the next big challenge we're going to need to tackle?
You just said one of them, which is plasticizers. I think that this world of plastics, microplastics, tiny particles of plastics that are in a lot of our food and a lot of our bodies, and pervasive and full of phthalates and, certain chemicals that are estrogenic, like that's a cause of deep concern. And I think one of the upcoming big challenges is sort of what are the contaminants that aren't pesticides and heavy metals that are getting into our food. PFAS is another one, per and polyfluoroalkyl. I almost said it right, but polyfluoroalkyl substances. So these are what we're calling the forever chemicals. These are, they've been used in Teflon. They've been used in like the carpet coating. They make things, sort of very water and moisture resistant, and things roll right off of butcher paper in stores, food packaging, anywhere you want to have. Popcorn bags was one of the earlier applications of it. That super smooth, oil-proof surface. So those have been in so many areas of our lives for so many years, and they're radically persistent in the environment. They're in our waterways, they're in our soil, and in our bodies, and have some pretty strong associations with cancer, and other immune system issues, developmental issues. They're bad. And so something that's going to take huge effort in both food safety and integrity, but also environmental preservation and restoration to undo the damage that's been done by nearly a century of industrial use of those chemicals.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I feel like I've been seeing PFAS especially bubble up more and more in the news. There was actually an article in the New York Times this morning that I was reading, and there was an interesting quote. It was in their morning newsletter, and I clicked into it. And there was an interesting quote in there from a doctor that was at the very end of the article, and I won't remember the quote exactly, but it was something like, basically, there needs to be regulatory change and bigger change. You can't buy yourself out of, exposure. Like, you can't, it's everywhere. And so there really needs to be regulatory change in order to really diminish the levels of PFAS and these forever chemicals that are in the environment, because you can't escape them. They're everywhere.
We can take some steps to control, choosing food packaging that doesn't have PFAS, choosing cookware that is safer, but in general, they're so pervasive in the environment, they can't be completely avoided at this point. And then the other challenge I wanted to throw in there too is just accessibility. We are lucky to have brands like Little Spoon that are leading the charge in baby food and in other categories. There are really high integrity brands that are sourcing with integrity, that are creating safer products. But I think regulations have a role to play in ensuring that everyone, regardless of access and socioeconomic status, has access to safe food. And I think, that's one of the reasons we need regulatory change around kid and baby products, is to protect everyone, not just folks with the resources and access to find, source, and buy better brands.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with that more. Okay, so last question. Do you have a personal story or a moment that really made you realize how important it is to go above and beyond when setting standards, especially for babies and kids?
That's, the one that pops to mind is more professional, but for me, the personal is professional. Like, it's a single ball of ideas. But so back, we take for granted now in 2024 that BPA is out of our, baby bottle and food container supply. But back in 2007, the default material for baby bottles was BPA. The scientific community did not understand fully the estrogenic potential of BPA and the extent to which it leaches into products in the containers, especially things that are heated and acidic, like milk and a baby. And so back in 2007 at Whole Foods, we started to become aware of this issue. It was something I hadn't really thought of. My focus had been more on food safety and standards. And as we peeled back the layers and started to work with, estrogenic activity researchers and consumer safety advocates who, came to us with these emerging issues around BPA, and we started to dig into the research, it was shocking. And, not just as a food safety issue in general, but because if anyone is susceptible to harm from estrogenic activity, it's our little ones with developing brains and bodies. And so that was one where, I was shocked that these substances, we didn't know what we did sooner about these materials. And, we at Foods at the time took them off of the market as quickly as we could. And I think that swift action drove a lot of change across the industry. Brands reformulated their products to meet our new standards. And, now you go in, whether you go into Whole Foods or Walmart or Target, there is no BPA in the baby category.
What a wonderful example of setting your own standard and having other people follow.
Of regulations, which, as far as I know, still would allow it.
Yeah.
And that's another area where on that issue, the plastics industry and the chemical industry wield a lot of influence in Washington. And, when we made that ban, I had hate mail from the American Chemistry Council, which is not an association of chemistry teachers. It is the chemical industry and plastic lobby organization that were, just aghast that we were disparaging the beautiful and safe products. And, those forces are still in effect. And it's one of the reasons that retailers and brands often have to act as their own regulator and create these standards, and because it takes time for the FDA to catch up, if at all.
Well, I can't thank you enough for sharing all of this today. I think parents are going to feel better and more confident about the food choices they're making after hearing everything that you had to say. I definitely learned a lot myself. Your passion for food safety really shows, so thank you for all of the amazing work you're doing. And to everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. And make sure to tune in for our next Power to the Parents Q&A, where we will keep talking about the stuff that really matters to you and your family. Thanks again so much, Joe.
Angela, thanks so much. It's been wonderful talking with you, and I look forward to talking again soon.